If you're just getting started with DIY and making your own stuff, then it can be pretty confusing to work out which tools you need and which tools you definitely don't. Why are there so many screwdrivers? So I asked my subscribers for recommendations of what we think should go into every DIYer's foundational toolkit. Now we're talking power tools. And what we came up with might just surprise you. Oh, you definitely need one of these. Spoiler, you probably don't. Hey, Pete here from Northern Works. Over the last couple of years, I've been pretty lucky to grow out my selection of tools, but I didn't have all of these tools when I started, and you definitely don't need these tools to start. So in this episode, I'm going to help you work out what are the right tools for you, bust a few myths along the way, and tell you what I think should be the first few tools into every new maker's toolkit. Now I've got a theory about making that no matter what it is that you're doing, there's pretty much only ever 4 skills that you're using: measuring, cutting, joining and finishing. And any project or any piece of furniture that you're making, you're usually going to be doing one of these 4 things, and it's these 4 things that you need tools for. So we're going to go through each one of these and I'll show you what you might need. Also, there's a storm warning at the moment, so sorry about the noise, and if the roof flies off, that's why. Right, let's start with measuring, which on the face of it probably feels like the simplest of all the things, and yet there's still a surprising amount of tools to choose from, even for something so simple. You know, there's all sorts of different activities you do in measuring, like checking something is square or checking something is level, like using the massive spirit level. You might use something like this, which is a sliding bevel, which allows you to choose the angle if you're cutting pieces of wood for rafters or whatnot. But to be honest, there's almost nothing as useful, especially when you're starting out, than just a simple tape measure. And you can pick these up super cheaply. I've got about 7 hanging around the house. They're always useful, whether you're actually measuring up to see if something's going to fit, or deciding what size of mantelpiece you need to buy, or a cabinet or something like that. But also actually marking up the wood before you cut it, or metal, or whatever that is. And then you get on to actually marking, which is kind of part of measuring. And if you're making something really fine, like a piece of furniture, then you might think about getting something like this, which is a marking knife. But I'll be totally honest with you, in the 2 years that I've been taking this seriously, there's almost no time when I've thought the pencil that I've ended up using hasn't been the right tool for the job. So pencils before knives. Right, I'm in the mood to bust some myths. Myth number 1 is that cheaper tools will cost you more in the long run. And this comes from the idea that a cheap tool might be cheap up front, but you're going to end up having to replace it more often, or that tool's going to break, or actually that tool is not going to be fit for purpose. It's going to slow you down, and it's going to take longer to do a job, which ends up costing you more time and more money. Now, I think there is some truth to this myth once you've got started, once you're kind of really into it and you've been doing a lot of DIY or making. But when you're right at the start of your journey, any tools you can get your hands on is better than nothing. And then once you've really worked out what it is that you might need, then you can invest in better tools. Compared to measuring, cutting is actually a really varied set of skills. Everything from stripping a wire with a knife right through to flattening a tabletop with something like an electric plane. And across that varied set of different techniques, of course, there's hundreds, thousands of different styles of tools. So where do you start? The most important skill, and probably the first thing you'll end up doing, is just cutting a bit of wood into 2 bits of wood. And to start with, you can't really go wrong with just a simple handsaw. They're much more versatile than people give them credit for, and it's a good workout as well. Now obviously, as you move on, you might select to get something that's powered, and you could get something like a circular saw, which is really good at cutting straight lines really fast. So if you use a lot of things like MDF or plywood, that's a great choice. And a lot of people also like to get a jigsaw, which feels a bit safer to some people and is a bit more versatile if you're trying to cut round corners and things like that. It can be really useful. The next thing in the cutting category is a drill. A power drill like this is going to be super helpful, whether you are drilling screw holes into wood or whether you're drilling into the wall to hang up a picture frame. Getting a combi drill, something that's got screw and drill and hammer drill, so it'll go into hard surfaces, is going to work out really well. You don't need to get a battery one. My first drill, and a drill that I still use today, has got a power cable, and they're perfectly fine, especially if you're not kind of going up ladders and things like that. No problem at all. And the next thing on my cutting list would be chisels. These are really useful, not just for making fine cuts or if you're getting into like fine joinery, that kind of thing, but they can also be really useful for just prizing things apart. But don't use your sharp, good chisels just for prizing things apart. And then the last thing that I put in the cutting box is smoothing and shaping. So smoothing is, you know, taking something that's really rough or taking something that's too thick and smoothing that down to the right shape or size. And for that, you're going to use planes, whether that's a hand plane or an electric plane. And then one of my absolute favorite tools to use, which falls in the shaping category, is a router. I've just got a little trim router. People have big, huge routers as well. I use this all the time for making different shapes out of wood, putting roundovers on or chamfers, whatever it is. Routers are really useful, but you don't need them to start with. Myth number 2 is that better tools make you a better maker. And this one's just complete and utter rubbish. If you're crap at cutting with a cheap saw, you're still going to be crap at cutting with an expensive saw. It's not the tool that makes you a better maker, it's practicing how you use that tool and practicing the skills that you need in order to make stuff happen. So invest your time and energy practicing those skills with the tools that you've got, and then when you do get better tools, you'll be a better maker who knows how to use them. Now obviously there comes a point in most projects where you have to join two things together, whether that's a mirror or a picture frame to the wall or two pieces of wood together to build a beautiful table. And just like cutting, which tool you need depends really on exactly what kind of joining you're doing. So for example, if you're using screws to join two things together, then you're going to need a screwdriver. And most people, especially early on, can get away with just a good quality Phillips head and a flat head, and that's going to do most jobs around the house, especially if you're doing things like changing plugs or putting up picture frames. And often people will say, well, do I need a separate powered screwdriver? And I'd say, not really, especially if you get a drill, that's going to have all of the screwing power that you need. If you're using a nail or a pin, then you're going to need a hammer. And now, one thing to think about with hammer and with nails is they can often go wrong, and that's where a pair of pliers comes in handy. And actually a pair of pliers is just useful to have around the house anyway. A little bit cutting, a little bit joining, a little bit of everything really. When you start to get to the point where you're gluing things together, maybe you're gluing up a piece of furniture, then a mallet can come in quite handy for that. Something that's made of wood, that's not going to mark the surface quite as much as a metal hammer will do, but you know, be careful with these things, they can really pack a punch. I made this out of a couple of offcuts of ash, and you know, you can pick these up pretty cheaply anyway. And if you are joining things together, then having a clamp is never a bad idea, but especially if you're gluing things up and making furniture. One of my pet peeves is the number of times that YouTubers say things like, well, you can never have enough clamps, you can never buy too many clamps, I didn't have enough clamps for this project. Honestly, you don't need that many. You can get away with fewer than you think if you're really careful. There's another thing that YouTubers say in the next section. And the third myth is that you can't make anything quality with just cheap tools. And again, I'm calling this absolute crap. If we think back over all of the millennia that people have been making things on this earth, none of those people had access to half of the stuff that we've got access to now, at even the bottom of the price point. Don't turn your nose up at tools just because you think they're not the cool ones and the ones that you've seen other people using. You can build some really incredible stuff, some very simple tools and some very cheap tools. And of course, the last step of almost every project is finishing. And this is preparing a surface, whether that's sanding, something like that. And maybe it's filling filling a little hole in the wall that you've done with your hammer, if you've been a bit over the top. And then actually applying maybe a decorative finish or something like that, paint, that kind of thing. And this brings me to my second gripe about most YouTubers. You're going to hear this time and time again, how much people hate sanding. And yeah, it can take a long time, but do you know what? Pop a podcast on, you'll be fine, champ. Anyway, if you want to make your sanding last a little bit shorter, then it can be tempting to reach for an orbital sander, something like this, or another power sander as one of your first tools. But actually, for most first projects, you can get away with just some normal sandpaper. Get yourself a sanding block or wrap it around a piece of wood to get a flat surface, and that'll do the trick 9 times out of 10. You really need an electric sander when you're doing bigger pieces, you know, huge tabletops, whole panels, that kind of thing. And that's pretty much all you need for finishing. You know, you might use a specialist tool like a putty knife or something if you're filling in, but you don't need to overcomplicate it. Right, the last thing before I tell you what I'd put in almost every first DIY toolkit: PPE. Don't forget to get a good pair of safety glasses and a good mask at the very least. And if you're using power tools in any sort of closed environment, a pair of good ear defenders. Trust me, it just isn't worth risking your health long term for this stuff. Well, the good news is the roof is just about still on in this storm. So it's time for me to tell you what I think should go in everyone's first DIY toolkit. And I'm starting with a saw, and I would go for just a general purpose saw, but try and get one with a straight edge and a 45-degree angle on it. And then some screwdrivers. You can either go for a good set of Phillips head and flat heads, or you could go with one of those combination drivers that's got a whole bunch of different attachments. Then I would get yourself a drill. And I think it's better to go for something with a cord rather than a cheap battery powered one. One with a cord is going to give you more power for less money, and those cheap battery ones are usually a bag of spanners. Then I would have a tape measure and a pencil, and finally a hammer. And that is a really decent set of starter tools. There's a lot you can do around the house, whether that's putting up pictures and that kind of thing, and actually you could probably make some pretty decent furniture just with these tools. After that, I would go for a knife and a pair of pliers, really useful. And then maybe a set of chisels. They don't have to be expensive, but it needs to be something that you can get really, really sharp. There's nothing worse than a blunt chisel. Then I'd get a spirit level. This is a teeny tiny one, but you know, bigger probably is a bit better. And then a couple of clamps, which are really useful for all sorts of different jobs. And then after that, you know, just get specialist tools as and when you need them. For most jobs, you can usually find a way of doing things with cheaper tools rather than splashing out on something really expensive. Did I miss anything? Leave a comment below and let us know what you think you would put in an essential DIY toolkit. And if you still think that you can't build quality, useful stuff for your home using just some simple tools, then I've got some projects coming up that are going to show you how you can learn to use your tools, develop your skills, and build some bloody lovely stuff. So make sure you subscribe so you definitely see those. And why not join the mailing list? The link is in the description. In the meantime, have a crack at making something. See you again.